Okay, so this parsha that we're going to study today is a parsha that it begins a series. It's sort of the end of the last quarter, the last third, excuse me, of the book. Well, in the last section of the book of Exodus, and it's the portions that discuss the commandment to build a temple or a mishkan. In English, it's a tabernacle. It's a movable temple in the desert. And what's many things that are strange about these parshas. So it's actually a series of 4 parshas. This week, next week, and then we have one break, and then again 2 more weeks. So there's a lot of repetition. And the Torah gives us specific details of exactly how to construct the furniture for this home for God, the temple, and also the furniture and the structure in elaborate detail. And that's this week. Next week, we have the description and commandment to make garments for the high priest. Also, very elaborate, very detailed, and also the process of how they prepare the temple, the inauguration of a temple. So that happens for this week and next week. Then we take a break for a week, and then we come back to how Moshe actually conveyed this information to the Jewish people. Again, down to the details of the design and the architecture and how to build every detail. So everything is repeated in a very elaborate way. And then, so you have God telling it to Moshe in this parsha, this week and next week. And then later you have how Moshe communicates it to the people, and then how they actually built it. Okay, so it's repeated and repeated and repeated. So obviously this is an important theme in the Torah, if the Torah gives it so much real estate. The question becomes again, why is it so important? Why is it so important to know exactly how to build a temple? To the extent that we're going to spend 4 portions on this. And the question becomes even stronger, considering that this was not the temple that was supposed to be permanent in Jerusalem. We're going to be discussing the temporary temple, the portable temple that was built in the desert for the 40 years that the Jewish people were in the desert. So we're spending so much time in the Torah, 4 portions for something that is not even permanent. Now, the truth of the matter is that the structure wasn't permanent, but the furniture was permanent. In other words, in the temple in Jerusalem, you also had the same furniture that you had in the temple in the desert. And also, when you talk about the temple in Jerusalem, certain aspects were equal, were the same. In other words, you had certain similarities between the temple in the desert and the temple in Jerusalem. So it's not like none of this was relevant, but still it seems to be interesting that we spend so much time on the intricate details of how to build this movable temple in the desert. And this creates an entire genre of commentary that is not just Hasidic commentary, it's also pre-Hasidic, but the Hasidic interpretation takes it even further. And the principle of this, getting the sunlight here, and the genre basically says that every detail of the temple must be a symbol for something spiritual that happens within the person and the person's relationship with God. So down to the dimensions, when you're going to read that we're going to make the ark, and the ark has to be 2.5 cubits by 1.5 cubits, and the height has to be 1.5, as opposed to the table, which is 2 cubits by 2 cubits, down to the cubit, every dimension and every detail that's listed in the Torah regarding the temple and its vessels must, in addition to the practical meaning, this is how it should be constructed for the beauty, it also has to have spiritual significance. And then that creates an entire genre of learning of what is the significance of all these details. And I can't tell you that I know the significance of every detail. That would take a few lifetimes. So I don't know. It takes a lot of creativity. But there are a lot of details that have been explained and have been elaborated upon, which actually are quite fascinating. So what I'm trying to say is I was giving an introduction to reading the Parsha in a nutshell, because I'm afraid that the Parsha in a nutshell is going to scare you away. You're going to say, why am I reading about this? I'm not an architect. I'm not a designer. I'm not building a temple in the desert at any point in the near future. So why am I doing this? So that's why I made the introduction and say, if you stick around, we're going to also talk about how this is relevant in this human soul and some important points in our relationship with Hashem and our also psychological and spiritual well-being. So that's the introduction to the introduction. Like my friend used to say, but not my friend, my grandfather's friend, he used to say he was a prominent member of the community in Crown Heights in Brooklyn, and they would often ask him to speak, and he loved to speak, and he would say, before I start talking, I'm going to say a few words. That was his thing. Okay, so give me a moment, and I'm going to open up the Parsha in a nutshell. Should have done that earlier, apologize. Okay, the name of the Parsha, Terumah, means offering, and it's found in Exodus chapter 25, verse 2. The people of Israel are called upon to contribute 13 materials: gold, silver, and copper. Then you have blue, purple, and red dyed wool, flax, goat hair, animal skins, wood, olive oil, spices, and gems, out of which God says to Moses, they shall make for me a sanctuary, and I shall dwell amidst them. So the first you have to donate. All the materials come from the people, and then we make a home for God. On the summit of Mount Sinai, Moses is given detailed instructions on how to construct this dwelling, for God, so that it could be readily dismantled, transported, and reassembled as the people journeyed in the desert. In the sanctuary's inner chamber, behind an artistically woven curtain, was the ark containing the tablets of the testimony engraved with the Ten Commandments. In other words, you have the innermost room. The innermost room, you had nothing other than the ark. In the ark is the Torah, the Ten Commandments. On the ark's cover stood two winged cherubim hammered out of pure gold. In the outer chamber stood the seven-branch menorah and the table upon which the showbread was arranged. So in other words, you had a structure that was covered with curtains, with the material. In other words, with wool and goat skins was the roof. So it wasn't a permanent roof. It was skins and wool, curtains, but that was a covering, covered the structure. The structure had two rooms. The inner room was smaller, and the inner room had only the ark. The outer room had a table and the menorah, table for bread. We'll also read later, it also had an altar for incense. We'll get to that later. It's not in this parsha, the next parsha. In any case, the sanctuary's three walls were fitted together from 48 upright wooden boards, each of which was overlaid with gold and held up by a pair of silver foundation sockets. So you had 10. You had beams of wood that were gold plated, and the base was silver to hold up that beam, and all those beams were lined up, and they had a piece of wood running through them in rings and holding the thing up. I hope I'm conveying this, otherwise we need pictures. In any case, the roof was formed of 3 layers of coverings: A, tapestries of multicolored wool and linen; B, a covering made of goat hair; C, a covering of ram and tachash skins. Across the front of the sanctuary was an embroidered screen held up by 5 posts. Surrounding the sanctuary and the copper-plated altar which fronted it was an enclosure of linen hangings, supported by 60 wooden posts with silver hooks and trimmings, and reinforced by copper stakes. So in other words, you had the sanctuary in the middle. The sanctuary was 2 rooms with a cover. And then there was a courtyard around the sanctuary. In the courtyard was also what we call the outer altar, where the animal offerings were offered. Next parsha, we'll talk about another altar that was missed here, the inner altar with the incense. Why that's not here is a very interesting question, but we'll get to that. So that is this parsha in a nutshell. Like I said, if you weren't scared away by these details, the parsha gets very detailed and very specific. So that's the introduction. There's a lot to say. Some of what I said now, I'm going to say, I said in the past, and I'm going to say in the future also, because it's so powerful. You have to hear it again and again and again and internalize it. But there are also some things that you also have to hear something new. So I'm going to tell you something new. And how do I know it's new? Because I never knew it. So I couldn't have said it. Maybe you heard it elsewhere. I meant I never said it. That's what I meant. So what I saw is a very interesting medrash. The medrash says All of a sudden, God says, build for me a home. What happened now? Sinai, we have the Ten Commandments, and then now it says, God built for me a home. What the timing? What caused this commandment to come? So there are many interpretations. This is not the only interpretation, but there's a very interesting interpretation that the Medrash brings, and the Medrash says as follows: this is a parable. What is the parable? Let's say there was a man and he wants to marry a woman, and the woman is living in her father's home. So during the courting period, at least in the old days, the young man has to go to the father-in-law's home. He goes to the bride's home. He goes to the father-in-law's home. You want to visit her? You got to go to her father's home. And therefore, all the excitement is at the father's home, the bride's father's home. Once they get married, now the tables turn. Now the father-in-law is out of the picture because the young couple gets married and they move out of the house. Now they have their own home. So the father-in-law tells the son, he says, do me a favor. I want to come visit my daughter. So could you build me a home so I can come visit you? Now in Greenwich, what do they have in the house? They have, what do they call the house for the in-laws or for the parents? I forget what it's called. Somebody knows. I don't have it, but we have the attic. We put our parents in the attic. It's quietest point in the house. Now they want to negotiate. Sometimes you say, we didn't want to be in the attic. We want to be in the main floor. Okay, we negotiate. But you have to have a room for the in-laws. In fact, when my daughter became old enough, 10 years old, and she wanted to go sleep in the attic, so my father-in-law would joke. He would say, oh, that's my room. You can't go to my room. Okay. But you have a room for the attic. You have a room for the parents. So that's exactly what happened. So in the beginning, the excitement is in the father's home, the father-in-law's home, father-in-law. Once the marriage happens, now the father-in-law says, do me a favor. I want to come visit. Make me a home. Give me some place that I can stay. That's what the Medrash says. The Medrash says like this: before the Torah was given, where is the excitement? You want to come close to God. Where's the excitement? In God's home, in heaven. So you had Abraham, you had Isaac, and you had Jacob. These are people who are spiritual people who can experience prophecy. They have to go to the Father's home. When the Torah is given to the Jewish people, at that point, there's the marriage of the people on the Torah in some sense. What the Medrash is trying to emphasize by this parable is now the center of activity, now the relationship, now the excitement is no longer in heaven. Now the excitement is on earth because Torah was given on earth. And the Torah was given for the people to explain and apply. And therefore, there are many stories in the Talmud where the rabbis explain and say the meaning of the will of God is not determined by God, ironically. By the way, we're the only religion that says this. It's a crazy concept. It's a radical concept. The people determine what God's will is because God gives us the principles, and then God says, apply them as you understand, and that will be God's will, and that will be the decision that God makes. So now, once the marriage happens, once the Torah was given on earth, now the activity, now the excitement happens on earth. So now God says that make for me a home on earth. I'm tired of the heavens. I want to come to where the excitement is. And the excitement is here on earth. So I thought that's a beautiful concept and a beautiful idea, a way to introduce the Mishkan, the home for God, which explains that right after the giving of the Torah, now God says, make for me a space, because to symbolize that the Torah and the will of God and the excitement and the place where the unity between God and the people happen, the place where the unity happens and the intimacy happens is no longer in heaven. Once the Torah is given on earth, and the way to come close to God is with a physical action, with a physical mitzvah, and that's where the intimacy with God happens. So that's based on a Medrash, a new point that I never said before, so I'm very excited about it. Okay, that's point one. We can elaborate upon it if it's interesting. Otherwise, we can continue. Now, what I want to do is what I do every year. I want to show at least one point that to show what the classic commentators, even before the Hasidic commentators, how they look at the dimensions of the vessels of the temple and how they find significance and meaning. And meaning is fascinating because these values that are explained that are alluded to with these dimensions are actually universal, and they stood the test of time. So I'm going to open the text, and we'll just read. I'm not going to bore you too much. We'll read a few verses about the ark, a few verses about the table, look at a few dimensions, and I'm going to make a confession. Like I said this in the past, but this is too beautiful to skip. Okay, so in the beginning of the parsha, Exodus chapter 25, we list the 13 objects that the Jewish people were supposed to donate. And then we get to a very important verse that was in the nutshell, but I should have emphasized it. The verse says like this: "And you shall make me a sanctuary, and I will dwell in their midst." And this is the source for the commentaries who explain that everything in the temple is a symbol for what happens within the person, the Jewish person's soul. Because they look at the grammar of this verse, verse 8. And verse 8 says, "They shall make me a sanctuary, and I will dwell," what would you think? "And I will dwell in it," right? Build a house, and I will come to the house. So it should have said in it in the singular. Instead, it says, "I will dwell in their midst," bitocham, in them. So the commentaries say a very beautiful and poetic point. Make for me a sanctuary, and I will dwell within them. What's within them? Within every person's soul. Make a sanctuary, but the dwelling happens in the soul. So how does that happen? Yes, of course, there's a sanctuary which is holy, and that's where God dwells, but that's only one dimension of what's happening. The maybe even more important dimension is the fact that God rests within our soul, and therefore every detail within the temple also has an equivalent within our soul. So that's sort of the biblical basis in the verse for this concept that the temple is not just physical, but it's also a symbol for what we have to create within our soul. So that is a very important verse. You can't talk about the Mishkan, you can't read about the temple or any of these parshas without thinking about the teaching of the sages on verse 8. I will dwell in their midst, in the plural, referring to the soul of every person. Okay, fine, introduction. Now, the first thing we read about is very strange. The Medrash talks about this in a few places. I'm not going to talk about it right now, but we'll talk about it maybe in the next few weeks, which is when you have to build a home. How do you build a home? Well, you don't pick furniture before you build a home. You don't say, well, I'm going to go to the store and I see this beautiful couch. You know what? Let's buy the couch. You know what? Let's design a home that could fit this couch. It's not the way people do it. People build a home first, and then they fill the furniture. But what's interesting here, the way the Torah communicates to us, the commandment, first is the furniture, and then there's the structure. In some ways, the furniture is more important. And the Medrash discusses this whole thing where there's a dispute between Moses and Bezalel, the architect. The architect says, I'm not doing it this way. I'm first going to build the temple, and then I'm going to build the furniture. So we can talk about that later, and as perhaps a different week. But the Torah goes straight to the furniture, and perhaps, according to some opinions, the most important vessel in the temple. Because there's a fascinating dispute between two of the classic commentators, Maimonides and Nachmanides, or in Hebrew, Rambam and Ramban, sounds very similar, but Maimonides and Nachmanides, of what is the most important feature of the temple. See, the problem with the temple is there's so many things going on, it's easy to get distracted. What's the core message of the temple? So there's a debate. Nachmanides says it's the ark, which we're going to read about now. Maimonides says it's the altar. We could talk about that as well. But I'm just trying to say that so every detail here is important. The Torah seems to be following Nachmanides. The first thing is the ark. So let's read about the ark. Verse 10. They shall make me an ark of acacia wood, 2.5 cubits its length, 1.5 cubits its width, and 1.5 cubits its height. That's the ark. Then you shall overlay it with pure gold from inside and from outside. You shall overlay it, and you shall make upon it a golden crown all around. So basically, there's a wooden box, 2.5 by 1.5 by 1.5, and then the wooden box is plated with gold on the inside and the outside. In fact, the sages say that it wasn't really plated; it was actually 3 boxes: outer box of gold, inner box of wood, then that is a box of gold. So you have wood surrounded by gold on both sides, which is funny because why would you waste gold on the inside? Nobody sees the inside. So the commentaries talk about that. You're studying Torah, it's supposed to beautify not just your outside, but your inside, right? Having the gold, which represents the beauty, which represents the good deeds, it shouldn't just be external, it has to be internal too. So, but that's a separate point. But what I want to focus on is, so these are the dimensions. What's interesting about these dimensions? Commentaries point out, Kli Yakar in particular, he says all the cubits, all the dimensions of the ark have half. 2.5 cubits, 1.5 cubits its width, 1.5 cubits its height. None of the measurements are complete, which is interesting because usually in the temple, we try to make things complete. Everything has to be complete. You can't have a vessel that is blemished or has a hole. Everything has to be complete. And in fact, if you're going to look at the other vessels of the temple, the other pieces of furniture, there the dimensions are not half. Dimension is complete cubits. So it's interesting that when it comes to the ark, everything is halved. So let's just show the point. Excuse me, when you get to the next is the kaporet, is the cover, which is, we can talk about that also, maybe a different time. I don't know if we're going to have time today. In any case, we're going to go to the table, okay? The table. So you have a table, that's chapter 20, that's verse 23, chapter, I think we're in the same chapter, chapter 25, verse 23. And you shall make a table of acacia wood, 2 cubits its length, 1 cubit its width, and 1.5 cubits its height. Then you shall overlay it with pure gold, and you shall make for it a golden crown all around. Beautiful. Okay, we have a table. And the table, all of a sudden, we say, you know what? We go back to the expected, and we say the dimensions, most of the dimensions are complete. 2 cubits its length, 1 cubit its width. Here, the table is complete. And when it comes to the ark, all of a sudden, all the measurements are half. 2.5 by 1.5 by 1.5. So that's the question. Not a question, it's an observation. But again, coming from the perspective that everything we do has to be, everything in the temple is a metaphor, is a sign for how we're supposed to live our life. So the commentaries explain as follows. We have in our temple is we're a dwelling place for Hashem. Hashem dwells in our life. We have the ark and we have a table. What is the ark? Ark is study, Torah study, enlightenment. That's the ark. So yes, they built an actual ark in the desert. Later moved to Jerusalem. But we also have an ark. What's the ark? When you build a space, when you create within your mind a space for study and bringing the wisdom of Hashem into your life, you created an ark for Hashem. That's your wisdom. That's your enlightenment. Then you have a table. What's table? Well, what do you do on a table? A table is you eat bread. Oh, bread represents in the temple, the bread table was for bread. But bread represents human sustenance, the physical sustenance, which is fascinating because you would say, why do you have bread in the temple? Temple is supposed to be a spiritual place. So I understand why we have the ark, which is the Torah. I understand why we have menorah, which represents light, brings light. I understand why you have incense, because incense is the most spiritual scent that a person has, is smell. Of all the senses, the most spiritual sense is smell. Smell goes very deep within a person. Now it's like now science understands how deep the sense of smell runs within people and what it does to a person. So smell is very spiritual. The Talmud says smell is something that the soul enjoys as opposed to food, which is more for the body. So I understand the ark. I understand the menorah. I understand the incense for smell. But what is bread doing in the temple? Oh, very simple. The Jewish people understand that you serve God not only when you study Torah, when you pray, but also when you take care of your physical needs, when you eat, when you sleep, when you exercise, when you work. Physical needs is part and parcel of the home we built for Hashem. So therefore, yes, there's going to be a table in the temple, because in our temple also, which is our body, we also have food, and that's also part of the way we serve God. Okay? So now we understand why we have an ark and why we have a temple, why we have an ark and why we have a table. Okay, fine. But now let's look at the dimensions. What's my attitude toward my wisdom and Torah study? And what's my attitude toward my bread, which represents my physical needs? So the attitude has to be as follows. When it comes to wisdom, the feature of wisdom is I never feel like I mastered the wisdom. I always sense that there's so much beyond my capacity to understand, so much beyond that which I understood. And that's represented by the fact that the measurements are incomplete. They're half, they're not complete. If a person runs around thinking, I have all the answers, that's the antithesis of wisdom from the perspective of the Torah. We talked about this many times, that in biblical Hebrew, chachma, wisdom, is koach ma, the power to ask what. Chachma is synonymous with humility. It's the idea that I could sense that there's something beyond me, greater than me. But if I think I have all the answers, then I'm closing up my path to discovering new insights and creating new breakthroughs. So built into the concept of wisdom is the idea, the humility that I don't understand everything. There's something beyond me that I have to grow, and I have to be ambitious to try to keep growing. And of course, you're never going to master it because God's wisdom is infinite. Wisdom is infinite. God's wisdom is infinite. Torah is infinite. You're never going to get to the whole thing. There's always going to be more to explore. And that's represented by the fact that the ark, the measurements are halved. I always say that in the Torah, even not in Torah, but in Jewish culture, There's no word for Torah scholar. Torah scholar, you're a scholar now. The word is Talmid Chacham, you're a wise student. That's the best you can get. You can't sign up in a university and say, I'm going to do the course and I'm going to graduate the wisdom. No, you could say, oh, you're a very good student. You're a very wise student, but you're always a student. You never graduate from being a student. Even the teacher, the Talmid Chacham, is a very wise student, right? Because that's what we understand. Synonymous with wisdom is that recognition that there's something beyond my capacity and something so much more than I already understand. And that's true about everything, about all sorts of wisdom, that arrogance sort of closes down your ability to be open to the unknown. And again, no breakthrough ever happened because of arrogance, because I say, well, I know all the answers. If I know all the answers, that's it. It has to come from a frustration and a humility that the current answers don't work. That there has to be another perspective. Okay, that is the wisdom. Now let's shift our attention to the table. What's the table? Table is the physical needs. Physical needs. If a person runs around all day feeling that they don't have that they want more, and they're not satisfied with what they have, they'll never be happy. That's why the sages say in the Ethics of the Fathers, Ezehu Ashir, who is wealthy? Who is wealthy? A very interesting question. Take a survey. What is wealth? Well, everybody will tell you something else depending on who their neighbor is, right? If you're wealthy means I have more money than my neighbor. That's wealthy, right? Depending where your neighbor lives, that determines how wealthy you have to be consider yourself wealthy. But the point is, what does the sages say? The sages say, who is wealthy? One who is happy with their lot. Because in the physical world, the nature of the physical ambition is that ambition is a wonderful thing. It helps you create success. But the problem is, if it's not checked, then I'm never happy. I'm never happy because whatever I achieve, the other guy has more than me. And the sages say, you want to be happy, you have to be happy, you have to be fortunate, you have to be satisfied with your lot. So the Kli Yakar says that's why the table has complete measurements. Whatever I have, I'm happy with, and I'm satisfied. And that's why the measurements are complete, as opposed to the to the wisdom, which is incomplete. Now, that's what the Kli Yakar says. I added something. Could be it's right, it could be it's wrong. I don't know. I think that even in the physical sense, you have to have some ambition. If you're just happy, you're not going to be ambitious. There's some tension between ambition and happiness, right? If I'm too ambitious, I can't celebrate the happiness. If I'm too happy, everything is fine, I'm not ambitious. By the way, some of the happiest people on earth, some of the happiest countries, they do surveys. They do surveys of happy countries. Some of the poorest countries are the happiest countries. Because if there's no ambition, everybody's happy. Now, there is a problem with that. So I think the Kli Yakar doesn't say this, but I say this. I may be right, I may be wrong. Let's look back at the ark. Let's look back at the table. Table's dimensions. Table's dimensions. Where are we? Okay, verse 23. Shall make a table of acacia wood, 2 cubits its length, 1 cubit its width, and 1.5 cubits its height. In other words, even in the table, there's some room for ambition. So 1.5, which shows you're not complete. So even in the physical sense, you need some ambition. But in the physical sense, you have to also be able to turn off the ambition when you come home. And you come home, and it's the weekend, and you finished working. And like the Talmud says, what is Shabbat? Shabbat is not doing any work, turning off your cell phone. That's true. But Shabbat mentally is to see yourself as all your work is complete. On Shabbat, I have no ambition. No ambition on Shabbat. Even spiritual, I have no ambitions on Shabbat. Because ambition means I'm not happy. So the skill is to know how to turn off the ambition when you want to experience joy. When you're eating supper, you turn off the ambition. And that's why when it comes to the table, most of the dimensions are half. Only one dimension most of the dimensions are complete, 2 by 1, but the height is 1.5. So that's my addition, that even when it's physical, you have to have some ambition. You just have to know how to manage it. As opposed to the spiritual, when it comes to enlightenment, you never feel complete, because you can never feel complete, because that is enlightenment. Enlightenment goes along with the humility. So that's the story in short. I mentioned before, not everybody was on, but thank God we had a Mazel Tov. Chani gave birth to a healthy baby boy yesterday in the evening. Exactly. It's actually an interesting question. We have to figure out exactly when the circumcision will be, because he was born the minute of sunset. And halachically, between sunset and nightfall is a confusion. So I still have to figure out if he was born on Wednesday or on Thursday. But the bottom line is, it was yesterday in the evening. Everyone's happy and healthy, but I think we'll stop a little shorter today. because there's a lot to manage, but thank you all for joining. I wanted to study Torah, so the study of Torah we should never stop studying. So thank you all for joining, and we should meet each other in good health and always have good news to share. So thank you.
Thank you. Mazel tov, Rabbi.
Thank you.
Rabbi, Mazel Tov again. Only good news from you always.
Amen.
Mazel Tov.
From everybody.
Mazel Tov.
Thank you.
Have a good weekend. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Rabbi,
Mazel Tov.
Go ahead, Doctor.
first of all, congratulations, of course.
Thank you.
But my question is this. People talk about God being in heaven, and yet what you said today is God is in our soul. It's not above, that God has descended to earth, and that the way we should think about God is not something outside of us, but something inside of us. Is that correct?
That is correct, but it's not the whole story. It's not the whole story, because they aren't different without getting too philosophical. There are the philosophies who believe that God is transcendent. And then there are philosophies that say, like Spinoza, who says that pantheism, which says that God is nature. God is synonymous with nature. And Judaism says both are true. God transcends. God is unlimited. God is beyond nature. But God also invests himself within. And that's the paradox, that the infinite can also be in the finite. So you're right, God is beyond and he's within our soul. What's interesting about Judaism is it says that although God has both, where does he really want to be? Does he prefer to be in the expanses of heaven, which is metaphorically the spiritual, or does he prefer to be squeezed within the finite reality of the physical? And the answer is that we believe the essence is in the physical.
In our personal soul.
Personal soul, in the physical world, and a personal soul in the action that we take, limited action that we take. That's where the infinity is found. Even though it's in some way it's paradoxical, but we could talk about the paradox. Now is not the time. But that's, yeah. But the answer is yes. The answer is that according to Judaism, we are a religion that is very much focused on the physical world, not just for technical reasons, because we have to fix the physical world, but because we believe, certainly the Kabbalah believes and the Hasidic philosophy believes, that this is where the drama happens. Like I started out, I don't know if you were on in the beginning. Oh, you were. The father-in-law says, once the marriage happens, you have to go to where the drama is.
Absolutely.
The drama has shifted. And the drama has shifted to this world because this is God's will to sanctify this world, make a home for God in this world, which includes the physical world, but it also includes our souls.
Will we see you tomorrow, Rabbi?
That is a very good question. I don't think so. I'll send out an email, and I don't think we're going to do tomorrow. No.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you. Wonderful day.